Hi again, this is Jeff, your ProtoPie expert answering your ProtoPie questions. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. A little while back, one of ProtoPie's ambassadors, Eugenie, made this fantastic demonstration of liquid transitions, where you can just kind of drag from the right side, and then when you let go, boom, the next screen shows up in this wonderful animated manner. And we've had a lot of questions for people asking how we can do this. So I spent some time deconstructing this, and I'm going to do my best now to recreate Eugenie's fantastic work and show you how to do it. Let's jump in. So I started with Eugenie's pie here, and I stripped out everything except the three scenes. So you have scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and just the circle here that we're going to use to drag the item in here. And he's made each of the scenes as components, by the way, and this is going to become obvious in a little bit, but essentially this effect is a masterclass in masking. This shape here, this liquid shape, is masking the next scene. And that's why it's made as a component, so we can layer it on top of the current scene. And then when you let go, it reveals the whole thing before switching over to the next scene. We're going to start by adding the control for the circle here. So essentially what we want it to do is when the scene starts, we want it to move into the scene, and then we are going to set it up so we can drag it. And if we drag it less than halfway, it's going to snap back to its position here. And if we let go of it after the halfway point, then it's going to move all the way to the right, and the next scene is going to jump to. So let's add that. Let's add a start trigger. And we are going to move the drag circle, and I want to move it, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 40 pixels in from the left, so that is X356. So we're going to move the drag circle to X356, and we're going to animate it. Instead of using the default ease in and out, we're going to use spring, and that's the key to making this animation look as fluid as it does. We're using the spring animation liberally in this here, and I'm just going to leave the defaults as they are, but you can adjust these if you want more bounciness, slowing down quicker. That's what these two things do. So making the tension higher makes the spring more bouncy. Adjusting the friction makes it stop quicker, but we can just leave it as is. And if we preview this now, you're going to see it moves in, and let's just redo this again, and you see it kind of bounced a little bit as it did it. Now let's set up the drag on it. So with drag circle selected, I'm going to add a drag trigger, and I'd like to move the drag circle. And now I should be able to move it all over the place. And then when I release, if I'm to the right of the halfway point, I'd like it to bounce back and snap back to the location here. And if I release to the left of the halfway point, then I'd like the circle to move off to the left side, and we're going to jump to the next scene. I'm going to add a touch up trigger for that. This is how I'm going to detect when we've released the drag circle. So touch up on drag circle, and we're going to use a condition. When the X of the drag circle is greater than the halfway point, so 375 divided by 2. If we want to do some, we can just use a calculator. 375 divided by 2 gives us 187. We use 188. When the X is greater than 188, then we're going to have it move back to its initial location, and that will be its current Y is, where are we? Its current Y is 334. And we've moved it into 356. So we're going to move it to 356, 334. We're going to move the drag circle to 356, 334. And again, we're going to use the spring. And let's just test that to make sure that works. So I'm going to move it less than halfway and let go. And there we go. It sprang back to that location. Now over here, it's not going to do anything because I haven't put in a condition for when it's past the halfway point. So my second condition is for when it is past, so less than. This one was greater than 188. This will be less than or equal to 188 because we want to include 188. And we are going to move it, and then we'll move it to, let's see, x minus 30. How's that? Minus 30. And we want to use the spring once again. Now the spring adds in a duration on the timeline. And as you adjust these things, so let's say I want to add more tension, right? It's going to increase this because it's going to make it more springy. Or if I lower this, it's going to decrease that a little bit. And let's say I increase the friction, that's going to slow it down quicker. And you can see that shortens the duration. I'm going to leave this at its default, but the length of the animation is important here because I want my jump to happen at the end of this. So I'm going to say jump, and we're going to go to scene 2, but I don't want it to happen immediately. I want to delay this to the end of this move here. So now if I preview this, and if I let go here before the halfway point, it springs back into place. And if I move it past the halfway point, there we go. So it moved over and then it jumped. Okay. For now, I'm going to turn the jump off because I don't want it to go to my second screen as I build the rest of my animations. But that is essentially the mechanics of how the navigation works, right? If I drag the circle less than halfway, then my control snaps back into its original position. And if I move it past halfway, it moves all the way and it jumps over to the next scene. But let's turn this off for now. Now the other thing we want to do is we want that fantastic liquid looking effect. So when I move around this, we have this, it looks like a blob that's coming up from the left side and it moves with the circle. And it kind of, you know, it distorts a little bit up and down, it stretches and it squishes and that kind of thing. We'd like to do that. Now, in order to make this happen, we need to work with some custom shapes here. Now, you can't build these shapes in ProtoPie, so what I've done is I've made some shapes here in Figma, and I've exported them as SVGs, and we're going to use those SVGs in here. We're going to start with these two, and it's done in 2 pieces, and you're going to understand why shortly, but I'm not going to go into detail just yet as to why I've done it in 2 pieces instead of 1. But let's go and drag these in. So here, let's bring ProtoPie back up. And we're going to use mask shape bottom and top. We're going to drag them into ProtoPie, and they're here. So let's now move this, snap that to the corner there. We're going to snap this to the corner here. Now there's a 1 pixel overlap between these two, and if I zoom in really close, you're going to see that there's a 1 pixel overlap between the two. And we're going to use that to our advantage as we stretch and scale this. That's going to cover up some scaling issues that might make the edge transparent. What we want to do is we're going to turn these into editable shapes because we don't want them black. We want them in the color we desire. In fact, we want them in the color of the next scene, which will be this purple color. So I'm going to select them both in the stack over here and click on Make Editable. And we want them below the drag circle because we want the drag circle on top. And by default, we're going to have them scaled to 0 width. However, we have to be careful when we do this. We want to make sure, A, that we set the origins properly on these shapes. I'm going to set the origin of the top one to the bottom right corner and the origin on the bottom one to the top right corner. So let's set that origin there, this origin here. We also want to make sure we turn off the aspect ratio lock here because we want the width and height to scale independently. We don't want to maintain an aspect ratio. So I'm going to turn off the aspect ratio lock here. And by default, I'm going to set their width to 0. And that will, actually, before I do that, let's change the color on them. So we want the color to be this purple background color. So let's grab that color. And let's make these 2 shapes. Make the purple color here. And now I'm going to set their width to 0. We're going to chain the width, the scale of those blob shapes, or those sinuous shapes there. We're going to chain that to the position of the drag circle. So when we move this around, it's going to stretch and squash the shapes. So that way it gives us that effect that Eugenie created in his here. So as we move, you're going to see the bottom one stretches, the top one squishes a little, and as we move to the left, it stretches widthwise. Right, so let's first take care of that now. So I'm going to set up a chain, and I'm going to use the drag circle's X property. So let's call this chain X. And let's scale. And this will be the horizontal scale. So the drag circle starts at 396 and its far left position is 0. So we're going to use those two. And we are going to change the width on here. So when the drag circle is in its initial position, that's off screen over here, I want the shapes to be 0 width. And the width when it goes all the way out, so you'll notice that as I move this, the shape actually is a little bit ahead of the circle. So I don't want to make it match exactly. I want to make it a little bit wider. So when I'm here, I don't want to use the width of the screen. I want to make it a little bit wider. So what I'm going to use is 400 pixels here. I have the wrong item selected here. I want to affect the mask shape here. I'm going to use the top one. And then I will duplicate this. And I'm going to do that Command D and change this to the bottom one. So now when I do this, there we go. You can see we're starting to get our stretch, right? We're not getting the up and down movement yet. We're going to do that next, but we do get our left and right stretch and squash here. Now let's handle the scaling up and down here. Let's rename this scale top mask, scale bottom mask. And now let's move this up and down. So I'm going to use the move trigger or the move response here on the top shape, and I'm going to use the full width and height here. So when the 0, actually no, I don't want this on X, I want this on Y. Sorry, I'm going to add a new chain here. We're going to chain the drag circle's Y property here. And now what I want to do is I'm going to move the mask shapes up and down in relation to the position of the circle here. So I'm going to move the top mask shape, and when the Y position of the circle is 0, then I want the 0 coordinate of the top shape to be 0. Now remember, we set the origin of the bottom right corner. So that's essentially moving. If we make the mask a little bit bigger here so we can see it again, it's going to be moving relative to this bottom right point here. So as I move the circle up, it moves that bottom right point up. And similarly, this shape, the bottom mask, the origin is the top right corner, and it's going to move up and down relative to that top right corner point. So let's move the top shape up, and then when I'm at the full height, 667, the Y position will be 667. And this is top mask. And I'm going to duplicate this and do the same thing for the bottom mask. Except I want to maintain that 1 pixel overlap. So instead of this being 0, 0, I'm going to make this 0, -1, and 0, 666, 667, 666. This will make sure that when we later stretch and squash the items vertically, if that causes the edge to be a little bit transparent, because there's that 1 pixel overlap, it'll hide that, that flaw, so it'll look like a solid shape. So now let's take a look at this. We can move left and right, and you can see now I can move up and down, and it is following the thing. Now what it's not doing is it's not stretching and squashing as I move up and down. Let's do that next. So in our, let's rename this, in our chain Y, let's now stretch. Now one of the things that we want to make sure we do here, so if we go back to Jenny's, when I move up and down, I'm only stretching from the halfway point. So the bottom one stretches and becomes larger as I move from the halfway point upwards, and the top one only stretches and becomes larger when I move from the halfway point and move downwards. As I move upwards, the top one squishes a little bit, but not fully. So it's not completely squashing down to 0. And the bottom one, similarly, when I move downwards, it squashes, but not fully. So it kind of maintains most of its shape as you move up and down. So we're actually going to use 2 ranges for each, the top and the bottom, to handle the stretch and the squash independently. So let's handle the stretch first. I'm going to use a scale response, and then when the circle is at 334, and this will be for, we're going to do the top one first. I only want to scale the bottom one and make it larger when the circle is at 334 or less. So we're going to say 334 to 0. And the height of these masks natively is 334. So when my circle is at 334, then the shape will be its natural size, 334. And when the circle is all the way at the top, I want to stretch that bottom all the way and make it fill the whole height. So that's 667. And let's call this stretch top. And let's make another one, another scale, and this will be for squashing the top. So let's rename this. We'll call this squash the top. And this will be for when the circle is at 334 to 667. So 667. And again, when I'm at 334, I want that shape to be at its native size, so 334. I'm not going to squash this down to 0. And it'll look kind of weird if I do that. So I'm just going to squash it down a little bit. So let's say we do 250 pixels. And now let's copy these. And we're going to do the same thing for the bottom. So stretch the bottom and squash the bottom. Except our values are not quite right. So in the bottom one, I only want to stretch it when I move the circle all the way down. So instead, we're going to do stretch the bottom when I'm between 334 and 667. And the bottom, to squash it, I only want to do it when I'm between 334 and 0. Now let's take a look at how this looks. Okay, the top is working. The bottom one is not stretching. So let's see if we can figure out what's going on with that. Okay, so I didn't change these to be the bottom shapes. Mask shape bottom. Let's take a look at that now. All right, that's not working right. So we've got the squash is working, but it's not working correctly. So okay, let's take a look. Let's take a look at what we've done here. When I'm stretching the top, I want to stretch it. Okay, I see what I've done here. I've reversed the animations here. So this will be 667, and this will be between 334 and 0, and this will be between 334 and 0 and 667. I actually transposed the animations for the top and the bottom. I had them reversed. So now what I'm saying is when the top, I only want to stretch the top when the circle is in the bottom half. So between 334 and 667, I am stretching the top, and I'm squashing the top when the circle is in the top half. Similarly, I am stretching the bottom when the circle is in the top half, 334 to 0, and squashing the bottom when the circle's in the bottom half. That's what this is doing. So now let's take a look at this. Okay, now we've got that liquid effect going. All right. So how now do we make it such that it shows the second scene? Now the nice thing about the way masks work in ProtoPie is you can use any vector shape as a mask, and typically that would mean a shape that you draw. But because we imported these as SVGs and turned them into editable shapes, they are now native shapes within ProtoPie that we can also use as a mask. So I'm going to pull in scene 2. I'm going to pull in the component scene 2 and just put it on top, and we are going to position it at 0, 0. And let's call this next screen bottom. And we had to do these shapes, by the way, let me explain this a little bit more. We had to do these shapes in 2 pieces so that way we could handle the squash and the stretch. So that way we get that, you know, as we move down, the top stretches and the bottom squashes and the top. So we needed to do this in 2 pieces to get that squash and stretch happening at the same time. So that way we had this more organic look to how we move things around. But that also means then we need to mask, we need to make 2 masks and 2 versions of screen 2. So let's pop in screen 2 again. Position this at 0, 0, and we're going to drag this here, and we'll call this next screen top. And I'd like to use I'd like to use these shapes as a mask. So if I just take this and I right click and I say use as mask, what that does is that takes everything that's above it in the stack and masks that. I only want to mask this bottom here. Let's rename that so that way it's not misspelled. I only want to mask this component in here. So in order to keep the rest of these from not being a mask, what I need to do is I need to group these. So we'll just call this bottom mask. And now this being as a mask only affects the items within the group. So it's only going to affect this bottom screen here. And similarly, I'm going to turn these into a group. And I did this, by the way, with Command G or Control G on my keyboard, or you can just right click and you can say group selection. That does the same thing. We'll call this top mask. All right, and we will say use as mask. Now this shape should reveal the portion of the next screen as it matches the extents of the shape as it stretches and squashes. So now when we move things around, you're going to see, now we're starting to see the second scene in there. All right, and if we let go, then it's moving all the way over, and if we had our jump on, it would move to the next screen. So let's turn our jump back on for a second here, and let's move this, let it go all the way, and then it jumps to the next screen over there. Okay, so that is more or less doing what we need it to do. All right, this will end part 1 of this tutorial here. We finished off our liquid effect. We've got the masking working. In part 2 of this video, we're going to add a parallax effect, a little bit of horizontal motion, and we'll complete the transition into the second scene. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.